Hi, I'm Kristal Hart, and welcome to the Kristal Hart Show. We are in Washington, D.C. at the Library of Congress, where the U.S. Postal Service unveils the 17th stamp in a Distinguished American series, which honors pioneering businesswoman Katharine Graham. Katharine Graham was the first woman to be a CEO of a Fortune 500 company, the Washington Post, and she was a pivotal figure during turbulent times in American history. With us is Justice Breyer, and tell us here at the Katharine Graham stamp ceremony, just tell us a little bit about what you knew about Katharine Graham and what she stood for.
Well, to me, she stands in. It's a very good day to have this. It's June 14th. It's Flag Day, and she was a patriot. She was a real patriot, and the Postal Service is the right place to honor her because she worked hard to achieve objects in the public interest, and she did all that, and she was fun. And it was fun to be with her. It was fun to be at her lunch table or her dinner table, and the whole time she's working not just for free press, but really for the country. And at a time when it was particularly tough for a woman. And she became a great woman executive, a great champion of free press, she helped this country enormously. And she was a friend.
And you were talking about the slogan, the Postal Service.
The Postal Service, it is the slogan. It's on the building, the Post building up by Madison Square Garden in New York. And it says won't get it right, but neither rain nor snow nor hail nor whatever, neither rain nor snow nor sleet nor heat of day will keep these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. That was written by Herodotus, the great Greek historian, about the Postal Service in Persia probably 3,000 years ago. All right? When I think of that, and when you think of that in the Postal Service, you think we're people who get the job done. We just get it done. It doesn't matter if people make us heroes. We get the job done. And that's what she did. She did the same thing. She got the job done. And that was good for her and good for the country.
I'm a governor of the United States Postal Service, and I was the designated official to unveil the new Katharine Graham stamp.
And tell us a little bit about her history.
Well, a very exciting history, as you heard from all the speakers today, and I was very honored to be able to dedicate the stamp to her, especially with her incredible history, what she's done for America, what she's done for society. And as a patriot and as an activist, we're very fortunate to have her on our newest stamp.
And tell us about the Distinguished American series.
Well, it's a series, she's the 17th in that series. It's a series to icons of America, whether they're activists or they're authors or they've accomplished other things. And, we were lucky. She was a patriot, entrepreneur, an activist, and a patron of the arts. So, incredible person, great candidate for that. We're lucky to be honoring her.
Usually there's a lot of candidates, aren't there, to become a stamp?
Well, there's actually a citizens committee that works hard to decide who they put forward, and that's who they put forward this year.
Stamp is part of our Distinguished American series. She is the 17th. So the series itself started in 2000, and it's a way for the Postal Service to recognize, distinguished Americans. So the people who've gone above and beyond and done something that benefited our country greatly. So the first one that came out was in 2000, and some of the recipients it runs the gamut of athletes, authors, former senators. For example, Jonas Salk is one of them. Athlete Wilma Randolph is another. She is the 17th. The last one that we released was in 2017. That was for educator Robert Panera, and that also was in D.C. He was educator. He was from Gaudiet university here, and he worked with the deaf. He was an deaf educator. So that was the last one. So it's been a while since we've had another one added to the Distinguished American Series. So we're very happy to have that. And of course, she is a pioneer. She is a trailblazer. She was the first female to lead a Fortune 500 company, and she obviously exceeded expectations. Maybe not hers, but it was a position that nobody expected, that you just didn't see a female do. And she just took the world by storm. She was very influential, and this is a way to recognize her contributions to the journalism world, and quite frankly, actually to the business world, because she was a trailblazer.
I'm Don Graham, and I'm by way of being your master of ceremonies this evening as we dedicate this year's Distinguished Americans stamp to someone we all knew. Hello, Elaine. 21 years after her death, it appears that Katharine Graham can still draw a good crowd in Washington. I am reduced to asking how my mother would have felt about being on a stamp. There are moments that I feel perfectly confident about what my mother would have said. This is not necessarily one of them, but my belief is she'd have loved it. And I do too, and so do all the members of my family who are here. And back to asking myself how Katharine Graham would have felt about certain things. And I don't know how she'd have felt about being on a stamp, though my feelings are basically positive. I do know how she would have felt about our 14th Librarian of Congress, Dr. Carla Hayden, who is here tonight. She'd have loved her. Dr. Hayden, Kay Graham was a close friend of Dr. Hayden's two predecessors, but she would have been delighted that Dr. Hayden is the Katharine Graham of Librarians of Congress, the first woman ever placed in the job, and the first African American. She is also an actual librarian who has headed distinguished libraries and library systems in the cities of Baltimore and Chicago, and we are thrilled that she is hosting this event tonight. Dr. Hayden.
Yes, I am a librarian. And it is an honor to welcome all of you to the Library of Congress for a very, very, very special dedication, because today we are honoring one of my personal heroes, Katharine Graham. And I have to also share with you that to be here with the dedication of a stamp in her memory and is also significant for me as the granddaughter of a postal worker. My grandfather was the postman in Tuscola, Illinois, little town. And I'm just thinking, that's why I have on blue. So when you combine Kay, and I got to know her through this book, as a career-long librarian and as a woman, reading her book at the time it came out was particularly special for me as a woman approaching leadership and in that. And her story resonated with me in so many levels. And it shed more light on her life and her lasting legacy, not only as a part of the field of journalism and publishing, but also in American history. And many of you know that the Library of Congress is the largest library in the world, with more than 173 million items, from the papers of the founding fathers, history makers, and giants in all the fields. However, most importantly, the Library of Congress is the home to the papers of Katharine Graham. And so, I just want to also say that we are delighted to have the family here today, and friends, and we are grateful to her family for entrusting us with the collection. Her papers are being processed and are going to be examined for the next 30 years. So the collection, though, after that time, will be open without restriction. And that date, and mark it down, July 17th, 2031. But at that time, freely accessible. And when you think about it, the papers will be housed right here in this building. That's why it's also so appropriate, right here in this building, in our manuscript division. And it will be open for researchers for generations to come to be able to access. Her papers will be joining those of her parents, Eugene and Agnes, Elizabeth, Ernst Myers, right here in the library. Also, we have the Washington Post historical collection, including manuscripts, newspapers, rare books, and more. And finally, we have the papers of various Post reporters and the collection of some of her friends and even competitors, including Al Neuwirth, Leonard Downey Jr., and Meg Greenfield. There will be, we know, a one-stop shop for scholars and researchers to have all of the papers here in one place. So therefore, you could see why we are so grateful that you've chosen the Library of Congress to be the venue for today's special stamp dedication and the custodian of her papers. Her story is America's story, and we are grateful to play just a small part in keeping her legacy alive. So thank you for including me today. Thank you for being here.
So Postmaster General, thank you so much for coming tonight. And I also want to acknowledge the presence of Kay Graham's dear friends, Andrea Mitchell and Alan Greenspan, who just arrived. So you wave to them. Many of you will look at that stamp, realize how lovely it is and what a great portrait of Katharine Graham and how beautifully done, and say, how the hell could Don Graham, who is famous for many things, but my aesthetic judgment is not one of them, be associated with this? To our good fortune, the Graham family has more than one member. And in events where aesthetic judgment of any kind is called for, we turn to my younger sister, I should say my much younger sister, who represented our family throughout the choosing of this stamp. And you are now going to hear from that sister, Lally Weymouth.
Yeah, well, you could say that brothers entrap you to doing all the work. So, as a woman, I'm sure many people in the audience might relate to that. But Don is very charming, of course, and he said, you know, the stamp things, and I'm sure you'll do a much better job. So that was the end of that. So anyway, I think that, as you know, our mutual mother, Katharine Graham, you've all talked about, et cetera. Anyway, Steven Spielberg did a pretty good job, we thought, in the movie of sketching out her evolution from housewife, as we knew her when we were kids, to CEO, publisher, et cetera, powerhouse woman, because she was not that when we were kids. But I was just 20 years old, actually, when my father died, and so my mother decided that she wanted to run the Post, which some people thought was pretty astonishing at the time, because they didn't expect a woman to run a paper, and A, and B, my mother would have been the first to say that she had absolutely no experience for the job. So she turned to me, because I was in Radcliffe, and she said, well, write my speech to the board of directors. So I did, and she actually published it in her book. So I just wrote a really pretty simple speech saying that I'm going to run our family, it's going to stay in the family, I'm going to run it, I'm going to be the publisher, and so on and so forth. So that was the beginning of her career. So she was really a nervous wreck. I mean, she would practice her Christmas speeches before Don and Stephen and myself and my late brother Bill. She would be in our bedroom saying, you know, welcome to the Washington Post Christmas party. And we would say, it's terrific, Mommy, you know. And then she would try some Art Buchwald joke, which really didn't go over at all with her. It just didn't work. But anyway, as you know, over time, and as Steven Spielberg showed, he condensed it into like a year or two, her evolution from, you know, housewife, mother, so on and so forth, charitable person, to tycoon. So it took quite a few years, to be honest, before she was making great speeches, et cetera, et cetera. So the journey, many of you in this room were actually watched the journey, because she would tell almost everybody she met that she really didn't feel qualified for the job. And as Don would say, she rehearsed, she was the mother of indecision. She would go over and over every decision. And I mean, she would ask us, she would ask every friend she had about, am I doing the right thing? And so, you know, it was pretty obvious. It was no subtle thing. But over time, she was really pretty amazing, and she pulled it off. And in those days, there really were no women in the workforce. I mean, you said, oh, there were a lot of women in the workforce. She was a model. She was no model. There weren't any women in the Fortune 500. She went whole weeks without talking to another woman. It's like she was the only woman out there. And there are pictures of her with all men at a table. So, you know, the women's movement was a lot later. When my daughter's generation, you know, stepped up to bat. And then there are, of course, I look around this room, and my cousin Gwen is in the Department of Education, and so many of you, including, of course, the star Librarian of Congress, are successful women in your own right, Elaine Chao, et cetera. But in those days, it really was unheard of to be a housewife, a wife, and then suddenly to become a tycoon. That was just out. So anyway, of course, one of the things that made her famous, that made Spielberg make the movie, was the Pentagon Papers. When her business advisors told her there was an IPO, okay? So you all know what an IPO is. It was supposed to make a lot of money for the company, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so they were very worried. They didn't want this IPO messed up by Ben Bradley, whose wife is going to be with us tonight. I don't know if she's here yet. But anyway, Ben Bradley is telling my mother, you've got to publish the Pentagon Papers, because the Times publishes them first, and the Times is shut down. And so an ambitious reporter on the Post gets a copy of the Pentagon Papers, and he thinks, oh, this is great, you know, we'll publish them. So the IPO guy, of course, the business people say to my mother, it's a complete disaster. The Nixon administration will take away your television licenses, and as you can ask my brother, who's really the expert on this sort of thing, it would be basically a total business disaster for the paper. We would lose all our money. And Ben Bradley thought it was great, but he would get another job, but we wouldn't get another paper. So actually, if you know, I think people have given, not to be rude, they've given the reporters and Ben Bradley endless credit. But I mean, it was really, really a hard decision to make, because, you know, Nixon really didn't like my mother, putting it mildly. And, you know, so, you know, when that call came at wasn't it Harry Gladstone, help me out. Harry Gladstone's, the circulation manager, you can imagine, 30 years ago. Anyway, he was having a retirement party at my mother's house in the backyard. So then the call comes from Bradley and Fritz Beebe, who is sort of a bore, but a great business advisor. She thought he was great. Anyway, so they say Bradley's on the phone, they're both on the phone, and Bradley says, we have to publish, everybody will quit, and la-di-da-da. And then Fritz Beebe basically, I think, although I was really not his biggest fan, to be candid, kind of gave her an out. He kind of said, it's kind of okay. Well, not great for the business, but it's okay. So she said publish, which was really the big move, right? And so then, you know, they published the Pentagon Papers, which is, as you know, a huge deal. Movies have been made. Steven Spielberg made it. And then the Washington Post, New York Times go to court. And fortunately, the courts ruled for freedom of the press, the Washington Post and the New York Times. That's, you know, has been recounted numerous times. Then the next year, of course, is Watergate, no less. And then we have Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. And not only that, these two young guys don't tell my mother who Deep Throat is. Now, everybody in the world thinks that she knew, but she didn't know. And so she's calling up Ben Bradley and saying, you know, really, this is not a joke. You better really know who Deep Throat is, and you better be a good source, because otherwise we're going out of business, because Nixon is threatening again to take away our television licenses. And as you can see, even CNN has done this gripping documentary, and you see him threatening, of course, in real time. You know, that he wants to take away our licenses, we'll go broke again. So this is nightmare number 2. But anyway, as it turned out, of course, you all know the end of the story. Nixon resigns. Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein are vindicated, Ben Bradley's vindicated. And again, I would say, you know, she really stepped up to bat. And for a long time, it was really unnerving, because as she would say to me, well, if this story is so hot, why is no other paper or television station in the country publishing it? And it really went on for months, like about 6 months, would you say? Yeah. Before, I think CBS, right, picked it up. And it was like, hallelujah, at least some other, you know, station is seen fit to publish this thing about Watergate. So, of course, they were vindicated in the end. They were all heroes, et cetera, et cetera. So, anyway, I'm going to wind this up not to bore your eyes out. And so I think one thing about my mother that is really frivolous in a way, but was really nice, was that she gave these huge dinner parties. And many of you in the room maybe attended some of them if you were lucky. And Democrats came, Republicans came. And Washington was a lot more civilized in those days. You actually were friends with people you didn't agree with. Imagine that. And a lot of business was done around those tables. And she was actually friends with Mrs. Reagan. And inevitably, when Mrs. Reagan would come over, the Washington Post would have a banner headline, Ronald Reagan does another evil thing. But those two ladies sort of walked their way around this. They would not talk about the headline, of course, but they somehow kept up this secret friendship of these little lunches. So I just think that looking back, it was a really more civilized way to live. And I hope that we go back one day to doing that. That's one takeaway I have from my mother. But other than that, I want to thank you all so much for coming tonight to honor my mother, which of course honors all of us. And so I hope you have a good time tonight, and thank you very much.
So I want to ask the other members of the Graham family who are present tonight and spouses to please stand so everybody can cheer real loudly for you. Gwen, Sarah, Laura. And now I want to ask the one person, many of us here worked with Katharine Graham, one person more closely than anyone else, and she will hit me for doing this. Liz Hilton, will you please stand up so the rest of us can cheer for you? Liz was Kay Graham's assistant from the first day of her career to the last. I am now delighted to introduce our final speaker, who is also the final member of my family, my brother Steve. Steve is best known to the world as the founder of the New York Theater Workshop, which has been producing plays since, I guess, the late 1970s or early 80s, and has produced Rent, Dirty Blonde, and other things that have become commercial hits, as well as others that are distinguished artistic productions. But Steve is also a professor of literature at Bard College near New York, where he teaches 18th or 19th century English literature to Bard undergraduates, and then, under a unique program created at Bard, rides down the road and teaches the same course, Mr. Justice, at the New York State Maximum Security Prison next door to Bard, where he has taught for many years. Steve Graham.
Aren't you glad that Katharine Graham only had 3 children? So our mother got more than her share of awards in her lifetime, including a Pulitzer Prize for her memoir, Personal History, in 1998. But she always retained a sense of personal humility about her accomplishments. And if some prophet had informed her that one day she would get her own postage stamp, her response, I think, would have been enormous pride, but mixed with a sense of disbelief. But she was also extremely competitive. So she might have noticed and been amused by the subtle nuances of distinction that I have discovered on the distinguished American series Postage Stamp Totem Pole. Okay, so she'd have been proud to have been accorded a 2-ounce stamp, which I infer to be superior to a 1-ounce stamp. But it might have escaped her attention that stateswoman Oveta Culp Hobby got a 3-ounce stamp back in 2011, as did fiction writer Ursula K. Le Guin in 2014. On the other hand, Ursula Le Guin never got a Pulitzer. So maybe there's justice. And in case you're wondering, as far as I can tell, from a little research, there is no 4-ounce stamp at this point. So if you want to send a 4-ounce letter, you'll have to put 2 Katharine Graham stamps on it. And by the way, I wonder if someone from the post office could explain to me why Albert Sabin and Jonas Salk, both of whom invented polio vaccines, got distinguished American stamps in the year 2006 on the same day, but Sabin's was worth 87 cents, whereas Salk's was a mere 63 cents. Was his vaccine less effective? I don't know. Other subtle distinctions exist as well. For example, in 2004, athlete Wilma Rudolph's stamp was issued in both a sheet and a booklet format, which I don't believe we've received the dual format. And despite Don, my brother Don's optimistic implication that Katharine Graham's is a forever stamp, I see no evidence of it here. Although, and when I checked in, I actually verified this, although they said, oh, well, it might become a forever stamp. So Yogi Berra, for example, rated a forever stamp, which I presume means you can use it 50 years from now. And of course, who can quarrel with Yogi Berra? But I'm curious as to why the actor Jose Ferrer also rates forever stamp status, which has been denied the vast majority of stamp-worthy distinguished Americans, including Katharine Graham. I'm sorry, Don. Jose Ferrer is a good actor, but no Bogart. But, and I hereby nominate Humphrey Bogart for a stamp. Anyway, but as I mentioned at the outset, our mother was neither egotistical nor self-important. In the end, she'd have been profoundly happy to be on a plain, useful 2-ounce stamp that will get our letters to their addressees, even if they're heavy. The letters, that is. And she would humbly thank the U.S. Postal Service for the honor, as do we, her friends and family.
You should all go to Bard and take Steve's course, but not the other place. One more talk. Katharine Graham loved and admired our last speaker. She loved this country, loved knowing about its history, and admired Michael Beschloss as someone who tells its story brilliantly and in the ultimate patriotic American spirit. He tells it truthfully, he tells it well. She also admired Michael's wife, Afsane, another pioneering woman, business leader. And I have been asked to tell you that Michael's newest book, Presidential Courage, remains on sale at better bookstores everywhere. Michael.
Thank you, Don. What Don is not mentioning, but you may get the idea that it runs in the family, is that Kay Graham not only wrote a great book, but she promoted it more energetically and effectively than any author in history that I have ever seen. But not the most important thing to know about her. I am so glad that she's being honored with this stamp, even with the caveats that Steve has suggested. She was a crucial figure, as we all know, in American society. With little preparation after the sudden passing of her brilliant and beloved husband, Phil, she became a newspaper publisher who took a great newspaper and helped to make it a world-class newspaper. As others have said, she went from 0 to 120 miles an hour to become an instant CEO of what was to become a large and successful publication, public corporation, at a time that there were almost no women in American boardrooms. But that isn't the main reason why Kay Graham is a central figure in American history. The reason I think that she's relevant today, maybe even more so than when she passed in 2001, is not just what she did, but who she was and what she believed. Well, what did she believe? She hated political corruption and she fought it. She hated lying and corner cutting and she fought that too. She hated financial malfeasance. And most of all, she protected the First Amendment and fought off threats to the freedom of the American press. And even above and beyond that, throughout her life, Kay Graham was a woman who loved democracy. Like our founders, like Abraham Lincoln, like Franklin Roosevelt, she knew that American democracy is always fragile and that we Americans have to protect it in every single generation. From an early age in life, she knew that fighting for democracy was a sacred obligation for leaders like her who had notable power and responsibility in American society. Mrs. Graham is often thought of as a progressive, and there are reasons for that, but I would say she was also deeply conservative in her passion to protect American institutions of democracy against people in earlier generations who might have been happy to destroy them. Where did this passion for democracy come from? What was there in her background? She was born in 1917, in the month after John Kennedy, by the way, to Eugene and Agnes Meyer. Eugene Meyer was the descendant of rabbis and other leaders of the community. He's often remembered as a vastly successful Wall Street financier, but I think Don will confirm, and Steve and Lally, that he was proudest of his career as owner of the Washington Post and his career in public service as president of the World Bank and chairman of the Federal Reserve a few years before Alan Greenspan, or I should say a few decades. When Kay was an infant, her father was the voluntary $1 a year chief of Woodrow Wilson's War Finance Board, which orchestrated American corporations in World War I to fight for democracy. Gene Meyer famously used to say about his daughter, "You watch my little Kate, she'll surprise you." And she sure did. Kay's mother, Agnes, was a champion of civil rights and public education, especially for those in our country who had been locked out of the full promise of American life. She showed, little Kay could easily have had a life of ease, but I've read everything I can on her, and I talked to her for decades. I've never seen any sign, and the family can correct me, that she ever, for a serious moment, thought of spending 3 minutes of her life in expensive watering holes or on a well-manicured preserve or on a beach. That just was not her. She showed her independence early on when she insisted on learning about the American underclass at the University of Chicago and married the luminous Phil Graham, law clerk to Justice Felix Frankfurter and Stanley Reed. Phil, at the time, by every account, impressed almost everyone he met with the radiance of his future and his devotion to American democracy. Kay and Phil shared, among so many other things, a devotion to civil liberties, devotion to personal excellence, and to equal opportunity. Not by accident that if you read the Washington Post of the 1950s, at a time that this was not very usual, the Washington Post was a strong voice for civil rights and outspoken against the vicious demagoguery and corruption of Senator Joe McCarthy. Didn't happen very often before the Post did. Then in 1963, as others have mentioned, Kay was suddenly the publisher of the Post, and we saw her intense devotion of democracy to democracy on full display. She was lucky enough at the time to be bolstered, as others have said, by Lally and Don and Bill and Stephen. But despite the Graham's old and extremely close relationship with the new president, Lyndon Johnson, and his wife, Lady Bird, Kay Graham did not restrain her newspaper from criticizing LBJ's war in Vietnam, which enraged Johnson and White House staff members. I once told her that years later at the University of Texas, I was talking to LBJ's old national security advisor, Walt Rostow, who complained for about 20 minutes about the Washington Post's coverage of the war in Vietnam. And Rostow angrily said to me, "Kay Graham has a lot to answer for." And he was absolutely right. I told that to Kay, and she grinned from ear to ear. 51 years ago this month, Mrs. Graham made the courageous and crucial decision to have the Washington Post, as others have said, publish the Pentagon Papers. And, think if history had been different. Think if the Washington Post had had a more timid or craven leader. There's a very big possibility that that person might have said, this is too risky. The Nixon administration might retaliate against our TV stations and the rest of our company. Or they might even try to put our editors and our publisher and our reporters in jail. That was not what the psychiatrists call a free-floating anxiety. That was very possible in 1973 and 1974. But, as Don and Lally and Stephen have said, what Kay Graham said instead was publish the Pentagon Papers, which the Post did. And thus Americans learned about their leaders' failures in Vietnam, freedom of the press was upheld, democracy was defended. And a year later, in 1972, it's almost like out of a novel. This happened with such sort of stately timing. In this same month of June, her commitment to democracy was once again tested when the Post covered the growing scandal of Watergate. Famously, Richard Nixon's former Attorney General, campaign manager, and henchman John Mitchell famously warned Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward about a part of Mrs. Graham's anatomy. Don, and Lally and Steve, as arbiters of taste, can I use the real quote, or should I? Fine. This is a quotation from history. Mitchell told Woodward and Bernstein that if they published one of their scoops about John Mitchell and Richard Nixon, quote, Katie Graham is going to get her tit caught in a big fat ringer. And later on, some of you may remember that she got a piece of jewelry with that part of her anatomy being ground up in a ringer, and I think wore it around her neck, didn't she, if I remember, on a chain. Gives you an idea of what she was like. Once again, she marched toward the cannons. And despite Nixon's threats of revenge, she protected the First Amendment and yet again defended our democracy when it was in deep danger. What would have happened, I will say again, if someone more timid had had that job, someone less devoted to democracy? I would say that without Kay Graham and the Washington Post, there's a very good chance that Richard Nixon might have grabbed a degree of presidential power that could have taken this country in the direction of autocracy. She helped to save us. Mrs. Graham's long career in journalism, business, finance, and as a world leader was replete with a lot of many less well-known instances of bravery as a champion of our Constitution. Without our luck in having Kay Graham where she was for 4 crucial decades in American history, we would be living in a different country today, I think it's fair to say. And as Carla and others have mentioned, she wrote this wonderful book in the 1990s, autobiography called Personal History. Do you want to hold that up again, Carla, just in case anyone didn't see it? I would suggest buy 10 copies, read it 10 times if you have not. I'm not doing this as well as Kay would if she were here, but doing my best to help. And in about 1993, when she was writing the book, I remember I ran into her and I said, how's the book going? And she said, the book is not going well. I said, why is that? She said, well, I'm worried that when the book is published, the only audience for it will be other heiresses who inherited big newspapers, which she didn't feel would assure a great large readership. This reply shows her modesty that oftentimes verged on insecurity that propelled her all of her life, I would say, to be her best self. And I think all of us who knew her can imagine her big laugh if she had been told that one day she'd be portrayed on the silver screen by Meryl Streep. She shouldn't have worried about that book. As others have said, it deservedly won a Pulitzer from her peers, was a huge bestseller, and was treasured by all sorts of Americans who were not newspaper heiresses. I can give you a case in point. I was once around that time of the book when it came out, flying on a plane, and was sitting next to a young African-American woman, and she told me that she had grown up in a poor family in Chicago. We had the same hometown. And she said, "Where do you live now?" And I said, "I live in Washington, D.C." And with wide eyes, she said, "Is there any chance that you have met Katharine Graham?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Personal history is the best book I've ever read. I feel as if I was reading about my own life. I went through so many of the same struggles that she did. She's my hero and role model." Mission accomplished. I later told that story to Kay, and she was pleasantly astonished. Our country has not been the same landscape as it was on the day that Kay Graham left us at the age of 84 in 2001. What parallel could we find in modern day America to her unbelievable combination of civility, warmth, courage, commitment to democratic values, and, as was mentioned by Lally particularly, and we've talked about this a lot, her lifelong desire to get politicians and other figures of opposing parties and opposing ideologies to sit down at the same table. I remember with one of the last big dinners she gave, that house on R Street, that fabled house in the spring of 2001, was a dinner for the new 43rd president, George W. Bush. And at her table, this was so characteristic, she sat smiling as President Bush and Warren Buffett argued about the philosophy of inheritance taxes. It was just the kind of scene that she liked to create. Nowadays, we are in 2022. We are sadly living in a country that's growing more divided by ever, and in which many people are worried that democracy is in danger. I was about to say, I wish Kay Graham were here to fight alongside us for greater opportunity and for greater degree of democracy and for civil liberties and to preserve our sacred democratic institutions. But the fact is that here we are 21 years after she passed, and we do have her fighting by our side. Prompted by this new Katharine Graham postage stamp, whatever its shortcomings, Steve, we should remember every single day what she believed and what she did in her own life to fend off brutal threats to our democratic freedoms. 21 years after her passing, Kay Graham's life, I think, is more important than ever for us to remember and learn from. It's a little bit like when John Adams died in 1826. What did he say at the end? Thomas Jefferson lives. Well, today in 2022, because of what she believed and what she said and what she wrote and what she did, Kay Graham lives for sure, and she's fighting right beside all of us as we try to make sure that our democracy survives and prospers. What better inspiration could any champion of democracy at this moment have than the life of this immortal and incandescent woman? Thank you to the Postal Service for honoring her, and thank you, Kay.
And I'm Kristal Hart reporting from Washington, D.C. Hope you've enjoyed this show. Thanks for watching, and mail a letter today.